Hi, everyone.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Welcome to what should be one of the final meetings of the Civic Education, Civic Engagement, Media Literacy Task Force. Thank you all for being here today. And the purpose of today's meeting is twofold. One, we were approached by the Secretary of State's office over the last few weeks, wanting to add some to the discussion on the Civic Health Index. So there'll be a bit of a presentation on that Civic Health Index today, and then also to allow us some time to speak to the final recommendations for the report that we will need to submit next month to the state on the findings of this task force. So before we get into that, I'll allow my co-chair, Steve Armstrong, to say a few words.
Yeah, I'm going to be taking notes so that we'll be able, I think our goal would be that we get everybody's ideas. We've got some ideas already, right? But today we get everybody's ideas. Kevin and I meet over the holiday, maybe not. We meet at some point in early Jan. How about that? In early January. That sounds, he's very happy with that. And then we'll come back with what we would consider a final report for a meeting in mid-January, where we would give you fine folks sort of a final look over or final approval. And then our goal is, am I correct, Kevin, to have this in by the end of the month? So that's our plan for today. So if you have ideas today, if you have suggestions that you want to see in the report or you think should be in the report, today's the day, even if you've given them before, perhaps, just to reemphasize them today.
So thank you, Steve. And I agreed. I think that timeline is fair, that we can have a draft of this to you by mid-January for your review. We will meet one more time to make any edits or final suggestions to what is already written. And then we hope to have a final draft of this to be able to be submitted by the end of January. All right, so just to give you an update on that timeline that we are operating under. And so with that, we'll move into item 3 on the agenda, which is a discussion on the Civic Health Index. Again, this was something that we were approached by the Secretary of State's office. And so we have a bit of a presentation that, or at least some findings or some information on the Civic Health Index. And I believe our member Melvet Hill is going to give us some of the information on that. Melvet?
Thank you so much. Good to be here today in person. So the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity and Opportunity and the Secretary of State's office, including the Secretary of State herself and her team, have been working collaboratively with us, as well as Democracy Center and other partners now that are on board to really look at the timing of doing another civic health index in the state of Connecticut. The last time we had an index was back in 2016, and the National Conference on Citizenship is the leader in doing civic health indexes around the country. And so each state is responsible for funding and looking at what are the indicators that are most meaningful for them to understand the civic health of their state. So when we think about civic health, it's a way that communities are organized to define and address public problems. Communities with strong indicators of civic health, and this is why we're interested. So communities with strong indicators of civic health have higher employment rates, have stronger schools, better physical health, and more responsive governments on local and state levels. And so for us at the Commission on Women, Children, Seniors, Equity and Opportunity, we were very interested in how people are engaged or how they're not engaged, right? And so what are the things that are preventing people from actually becoming engaged? And so is it education? Is it access? How do the social determinants of health play into overall civic health? And so these are some of the questions that the Secretary of State's office, as well as our team, are thinking about. And quite frankly, how do these things like civic health interplay with our economy and interplay with the overall health of our state? We've been having meetings with NCOC and also bringing in other partners. I would say back in 2016, there were about 30 folks on an advisory that helped form and shape our civic health index. And out of that came a number of outcomes that you're actually talking about, we've been talking about in this group. So we haven't solved the problems. We've kind of made some things better. But if we look at education and we look at how even in our curriculum right now, we talk about American government, but civics is not actually required. And so we want to build a constituency of young leaders to be our future leaders. We have to really get around understanding what is causing people to be engaged, who has access to engagement, and what will our future leaders, including our legislators and our executive branch leaders and judicial branch leaders, look like, and how can we continue to support and encourage those who are living in the state of Connecticut to stay here and to be those future leaders. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about today, but I think a lot of the work has already happened, and we're recommending that we do go forward with the Civic Health Index. As many of you may know, that the Secretary of State has a very limited budget, if not at all any, for civic education. Most of their work is really focused around voting, and they have a limited budget there. Also, as staff to the state legislature, our commission does not really have a budget. We have an operating budget that takes care of things like supplies and maybe some professional development. And so we would have to go outside to seek funding to do the thing that we actually need to do and really allow this civic health index to inform how the legislature is looking at the overall health of the state, and as well as the executive branch, like what are the things that we need to support people being more involved. So I would stop there and offer if there are any questions or if people need more information.
Is the system that you described from the Secretary of State, so is that the way that do all the states do them the same way or no?
Well, no, it depends. So we have been doing it through the Secretary of State's office as a leader, as our civic leader in the state, as we look at the responsibilities of the Secretary of State's office. There are a lot of civic organizations that come around and work with other like philanthropic groups who have an interest in some sort of leadership or who have an agenda to maybe encourage people to get things done on a local level or grassroots efforts.
So you'd mentioned local philanthropic groups. I was wondering, do any of those groups provide grant funding for a project like this?
So in the past, some of our funders were the Groundstein Foundation, I believe the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, also put in some dollars. But the cost of it has changed significantly over a number of years, right? So the last one was about 8 or 9 years ago. And maybe the cost was around $30,000 to $50,000, depending on the types of questions you want to ask, how many focus groups you might do, how wide and far you're digging, and how inclusive you are in your practices. So the demographics of the state also have changed somewhat since then. So we would encourage language accessibility and language access to ensure that all people are able to engage. We would look at accessibility in other ways, whether people are hearing impaired or seeing impaired or visually impaired, sign language, things like that. So the cost would be different. There's also the data sourcing and getting the data. There's also, translating that data into real information that people can use. And then there's someone who's going to write the report. And so all those things would need to be funded.
Okay, it looks like we have a couple of questions online, so we'll go to Andy Feinstein.
Are you suggesting that we recommend legislation in order to fund this, which would of course involve a fiscal note?
I'm encouraging that there is funding assigned to doing a civic health index. So whether there is something that's put in a line item for the Secretary of State's office or another office. But yes, we are encouraging that our state, if we are really operating within democratic practices and we're interested in civics, and we certainly have this task force, I believe that's important to the legislature to continue to do all that they can to ensure that this is an important issue. And it's kind of putting our money where our mouth is. If this is something important, then let's fund it.
All right. Also online, question from Jason Mancini.
Comment actually, I just want to note that Connecticut Humanities has also been a funder in the past of the Civic Health Index in 2011 and 2016. We plan to contribute funding. Not sure if that's a partnership or a grant at some point in the future. I've talked with folks about that. But we get our funding from the state. And so this is an opportunity for the state to make an investment. I don't want to be transactional about it here. But these are the kinds of things that Connecticut Humanities does engage, as we believe our civic health is critical to our democracy and to our state.
Go ahead again.
Thank you, Kevin. And Melvet, it's good to see you again. Had the opportunity to listen to you at the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities Convention a couple of weeks ago, and you were excellent on that panel. I think this is really important because not only is civic health important by itself, but the world has changed since the last one in 2016. It's a much different environment we're in today than we were 9-10 years ago. And I think we need the awareness and the education about this issue to be wider. And I think it's a relatively small amount of money in a state budget, 30 to 50,000. And with humanities and others willing to step up, I hope we can do this. And if there needs to be any lobbying, I would be happy to help lobby this, because I think it's critically important that we spread education and awareness, and we have a barometer of where our civic health is today. So I hope we can do it. Maybe this group can endorse it. And I think it's really important. And as I said, I think the world's changed a lot since the last time we did this. Thank you.
Where would we find the current index? Where would we look it up?
one place you could find it is probably on the Secretary of State's website, as well as on the National Conference of Citizenship's website. I'll say those out
Thank you.
loud.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, online, we also have another comment or question. Tony Perugini.
Thank you, Kevin. I think Kenneth hit the point I wanted to make is it would be nice to maybe use the Civics Index as a way to measure how the recommendations are working once they come out of this committee. You mentioned barometer, but it'd be nice maybe to use that as a tool to see what comes out of this committee for the legislature moving forward. If those recommendations are being achieved and have a way of measuring it, that's probably one way to utilize that tool. So I'd be in favor of something like that to fund that. That's it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments regarding the Civic Health Index? Okay. Certainly, I would tend to agree that the Civic Health Index could be used as a barometer for, whether or not some of these proposals or recommendations that we are making are working at all. So I think that is something that we could definitely consider including in this report. So moving on to item 4, which is a discussion on said report. With our timeline, as suggested, that we would meet one more time in mid-January to kind of finalize things and have a draft of the report to you for your review so that you'd be able to make, final edits. That is the plan. So what we wanted to use today for was kind of a last chance or last opportunity to discuss some of the major bucket items. So Steve and I discussed this beforehand of how to make this a productive discussion today without necessarily introducing a whole ton of new things that we won't have chance to get into this report. So we kind of reduced it to 3 separate buckets, which essentially is kind of the 3 buckets or the 3 names in the title of this task force: civic education, which centers more around students and schools; civic engagement, which is more community-based; and then media literacy, which can take on a number of different things. So we have these kind of 3 buckets, as I've said. And to talk about, we tried to encapsulate a little bit of what the consensus has been on this task force into each of those sections. And so if we take a few minutes here now to just kind of walk through what we've kind of put together in each of these areas of what we are considering to put in the report, it would give you a chance to maybe fine tune or give some final points that you would want to see under that category. Okay. So in beginning with the education portion of our discussion, we've kind of centered around this idea of a civic seal. A civic seal being offered by school districts, similar to the seal of biliteracy, which already exists in the state of Connecticut, that students would be able to earn through the completion of some sort of civic portfolio in their over the course of studies in high school. There's also been the discussion around an increase in civic credit for graduation requirements. And then also the idea of meeting all students where they are, regardless of background or ability level, so that they have access to the civic material, to civic learning, to civic engagement in their education and in their lives beyond. So again, that's kind of summarization of all of our discussions over the last 10 months that we've been meeting, of kind of those big picture items in that bucket on civic education. And so at this point, what I would do is open the floor if anyone had something to add to one of those particular bucket items that they would want us to make sure that we include in this report. Ted.
Yes, I do. I touched on this at one of our other meetings, and I gave you and Steve a report and indicated that I would like to discuss it further at another meeting, and another meeting is here and now. So I'm going to take the liberty of reading a report that covers the hows and whys, if you will, of what I'm going to talk about. And it's going to take a little while. It'll take probably 6 minutes. So please bear with me. I'm going to make a case, at least hope I make a case, for emphasizing current affairs in civics education. What can we do to ensure that students, as well as adults, especially voters, have an enlightened understanding of the issues? Most of the issues relate to current situations, the economy, foreign relations, immigration, etc. Basically, current affairs. Opinions are frequently based on misinformation from biased sources. We are addressing this with media literacy in this task force. But there is another group whose opinions are based on no sources of information whatsoever, other than comments from misinformed friends and colleagues. Even when and where unbiased news is relatively accessible, there are apparently many adults whose work schedules keep them too busy to accept it or to access it, or they're too apathetic or negative about the state of national affairs to bother getting involved. So how do we get to them when they have no access to media on which to become literate? We need to get to them when they are a captive audience, if you will, when they have to listen to us. Searching for the truly captive audience inevitably brings us to education, obviously, middle school, high school, and college. And here we educate our youth, our students, in civics and government and U.S. history. Teachers can address applicable current affairs in these lessons, although at present they are not specifically required to include current affairs in the lesson plans. And from what I've determined, talking to my local school district curriculum preparation people, so they both, we're in Sherman, Connecticut, our K through 12 school, and New Milford, Connecticut, where our high school students go. If they're typical examples, there is a certain amount of current affairs discussed just at from the standpoint of the interest of the specific teacher. I would recommend that periodic, perhaps bi-weekly, lessons in U.S. history or civics focus on a specific current issue. So maybe you get 10 of these in a year or a dozen in a year or whatnot. There could be 10 or so of these issues selected for a school year that would be predetermined by us or by the State Board of Education in a menu from which to select. The issues would be presented, offering the pros and cons for classroom discussion and homework, and this is very important, to evaluate sources and to use evidence, all in accordance with our social studies inquiry arc. It's essential, of course, that the teaching staffs be specifically trained to address these lessons so that both sides of any controversies are covered in an objective manner. This is especially important in today's climate of misinformation, with misdirected elected officials beholden to the most vocal extremes in both liberal and conservative, both in the state and nationwide, of course, and uninformed parents beating up on school boards and school staff over books and curriculum. Even in a small town like us, we have a little bit of that. According to an August article in Education Week, most of the teachers didn't plan to address the 2024 presidential elections in their classrooms, many citing the possibility of parent complaints and disrespectful classroom discussions. But I would contend, and I'm sure most of you from academia will have some more information on this, I would contend that many teachers see this as the perfect opportunity to address both media literacy and civil discourse, a discussion on something like the elections, for example. I would doubt very much that teachers and other mentors 50 years ago, when apparently we did have quite a bit more civic education, I don't have the specifics on it, but we all read about it, when teaching citizenship and patriotism was paramount, I would doubt that the teachers shied away from controversial issues. They probably dug into them pretty hardly. Or how about going back to the 18th and early 19th centuries when Hamilton's and Jefferson's ideas about government were quite different and presumably taught. So I've just been discussing the only real captive audience that we have that guarantees that the young, some of them high schoolers, currently eligible to vote, others voters to be, are informed. But, and here's the key, and this is important, it also has the advantage of reaching another somewhat captive audience, and that's the parents of these students. If we can get a significant focus on current events included in the civics, US history, or other social studies courses, we can be well on our way to reaching both misinformed and uninformed parents. If we put these lessons on paper, which were referred to in my old school days as weekly readers, or on a flash drive or disk, as a handout the students can take home and use to open an after-school discussion, continuing dialogue with their parents and siblings, be a great opportunity for them to practice civil discourse, and it would have a very positive effect. What a positive effect it would have in increasing the number of informed adults, informed voters, as well as, of course, our informed students, which would be the ultimate in rebuilding our democracy from the bottom up. The Connecticut C3 framework, referring to motivation of students, states that children and adults are naturally curious about the world they inhabit. I would add that questions and conclusions addressing the current world are more apt to motivate than those addressing the historic world. In order to foster motivation and a natural, almost automatic desire to discuss with friends and family what is taught in class, and to foster civic engagement, the focus should be shifted more in the direction of current issues. Now, I realize that the challenges facing K through 12 education these days present an entirely different environment than in past days. When in past days, more attention was given to civics, and we didn't have to deal with disruptive student classroom behavior, the distraction of smartphones, and many more students for whom English is a second language. But today's divisive and threatening social and political climate demands that all of us do whatever we can in order to get us back on track. It's difficult, but we've got to do it. Without a thorough grounding in good citizenship, which of course includes civics and US history primarily, the current arts and sciences curriculum are not going to accomplish what we want to accomplish. I would like to see a significant increase in the, as we discussed earlier, in the credits in civics and US history, including, in my opinion, a focus on current affairs that is required for school diploma. I would like to see that significantly increased, but I think from what our discussions have been, that's probably not very realistic. In that case, I would suggest at least the following small step. And here I'll read a short paragraph in conclusion with a proposal of something that should be written into the task force report. I propose that the task force include in our final report a recommendation requiring that mandated lessons addressing current affairs with related constitutional considerations be included in grade 8 US history and or high school civics and government or US history. These lessons to be supplemented with written or digital takeaways for after-school discussion with parents, siblings, and other contacts. The wording, of course, that could be rewritten. So that's that are my whys and hows. I prepared just a supplement primarily for my own information, though, as to where the current affairs would best be incorporated in our standards. And if we get to that detail, we can discuss it further. So what do you think?
Well, thank you, Ted, for that. And duly noted your point about current affairs. As a high school civics teacher myself, I agree with you, and I often try to incorporate current events into my course as I can. And I would love to see more people, more teachers teaching civics to be able to do that. So again, noted, and we will do some to try to work some of that into the report. There is a piece that we're going to talk about a little bit later with the civic engagement section. You referenced parents, some of this information coming up to parents and opportunities for people outside of school to access some of this that we'll touch on as well.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very
Could
much.
I just ask quickly, does anyone in the room or online have a question or a comment on Ted's proposal?
Hi.
Thank you for all that. I'm a high school social studies teacher myself, and I agree with the spirit of what you recommend. Everything you said and all the reasons why, 100% agree. Where I would push back is mandated specific lessons from the state. I agree with samples, training on how to teach current events, but we are professionals and I don't think we need to be told exactly what to teach and when.
I know that's probably. the
Just
way
making
it
sure
came-
that's clear from the teacher's perspective.
Pardon?
I think that needs to be made clear from the teacher's perspective.
Yeah,
That like
yeah,
top-down specific
understand.
requirements, we don't like those. Specific stuff, no, because current events change, but like samples for sure, training, I would love too. I'm not required to put current events in my Asian studies class, in my Middle East studies class, and my geography class, but I do it anyway pretty frequently. So I'm into this. I like this kind of thing. The way I figured out to do it, I don't know. I would like some training on other ways to do it, but yeah, we're professionals and we can figure out how to do it. I think that's my
Well, let me
slant on that.
Let me
Sure.
respond to you on
Sure,
that.
sure.
And I understand completely. And I thought a suggested list from the state would be helpful. But that would be, I can understand why you and the other teachers would think you're being mandated to teach something specific. So I would be perfectly happy as long as the mandated stays in there as including a certain amount of current affairs. I think it's the current affairs that I want mandated, not, and let the teachers decide specifically what current affairs. That'd be fine for me.
Yeah, I have a question for Stephen. Does current events occur in the state curriculum explicitly? You're more familiar with it than I am. I don't sit and read the state curriculum all the time.
The question was?
Do current events or current affairs appear in the state curriculum to your knowledge?
There's a civics course where there, if you're following the standards, there it is, some contemporary connection there.
Okay.
US history does have contemporary connections, but as far as actually naming anything as current events or current affairs, no.
Or saying like the skill in the required skills, searching up current events, discussing them, researching both sides. Like, I mean, those are skills
I
we
think
do
in
in
the
social studies
skills-
anyway, whether they're required or not, but yeah.
If the group, if we were to adopt this, I think it would be a calling it, a specific calling it out. Where I could show you in the standards, it's there, but this would specifically call out the need. Ted, am I correct for more and that's been being done right now?
Yes, but I didn't see specifically called out in the standards, anything that sort of specifically uses those two words as being a requirement. But yes, obviously, a lot of what's in the standards, and I think I gave you kind of those several, maybe half a dozen examples of where the current affairs might fit in with the existing standards. So yeah.
If we look at current statute, it does require 1/2 credit of civics in order to graduate from high school in the state of Connecticut. It does not require certain content to be taught. So in looking at what recommendations, and our charge as a task force is to make recommendations that potentially legislatively could be taken up. And one of the recommendations could be that we could make a recommendation that the state require current affairs as a course. I'm not saying that that would be well received, but that we could make the recommendation. We can make recommendations, but to Angie's point, and as a fellow high school social studies teacher myself, mandating specific content probably should be left up to teachers' purview. However, how do you kind of force the hand of schools to actually be teaching certain concepts or courses? That is something potentially that we might have more ability to sway, right? In the same way that we've required that civics be taught, can we require that a contemporary affairs, current affairs course be taught? And then also we can develop curriculum and resources as a state. The State Department of Ed can develop resources and professional development training in how do you incorporate current affairs into your civics.
Yeah, I think that would be great. In fact, that was the original direction that I was thinking of going, but I figured that was, I figured we could sort of pick some lower hanging fruit, because I think I got the impression from some of our previous discussions if we get anything additional added on, it requires taking something away from the same group that's sitting around talking about arts or sciences or STEM or whatnot. And then I just thought it'd be easier if we worked it into the existing curriculum, but obviously I'm happy with anything. I just want current affairs to be addressed. And I certainly would be happy if our teachers decided which specific current affairs they would like to address. Yeah.
A middle ground might be, we've had some mandates in recent years, like Holocaust education must be included in the curriculum. Native Americans must be included in the curriculum. That's a way that you could ensure it was included without mandating it as a specific course, which I think would be problematic. But also it would make a statement that we want to see it.
Sure. For example, another example very similar to the ones you just mentioned would be immigration, for example, or immigrants. Yeah.
All right. Well, again, your point is duly noted, and we will try in some form to capture that in the draft of the report. Lest we forget our online folks here, Andy Feinstein has his hand up, so we'll go to him.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple points. First, on the badge, due to Steve Armstrong's work, the State Board of Education now approved that as a legislative recommendation for the legislature this year. So that proposal does have some wings behind it, and our support of it would be added to it, and that may actually be something that can move. My concern is that I'm not against that at all. That's fine. Kids who really want to focus on that should be rewarded. My concern is the kids who don't want to be focused on this, the other end of the spectrum. And I look at civics education as broader than knowledge of how government works or even knowledge of current affairs, although I'm totally in support of what Ted is talking about. I think the real issue is treating each other with respect. And where that's now covered is in our failed bullying law. Now, I know we've spent a lot of time redoing that in the last a few years, and we have a new approach to it. But it seems to me that's where, to the extent we have this captive audience, we ought to be talking and we ought to be teaching about tolerance for people regardless of race, color, religion, political views. And the negative side of it is the prohibition on bullying, but the positive side of it is actually teaching that as a positive value. And I would hope that we could make some recommendations in that regard, not limited to curricular work, but looking at the school environment as the the cauldron in which to develop civic values and which to have students come out being citizens, being able to interact with other citizens, being able to discuss issues without resort to slogans or without resort to hatred. And I think, that's what I hope the task force will do. I have not, I think the recommendations for things like badges and course requirements and all that are fine, but they don't address the problem.
Thank you, Andy, and noted. And as just so we understand what we're doing here, Steve and I had kind of collaborated to kind of try to compile what has been discussed through our meetings thus far. And we wanted to try to include, we only have so many pages, right, of what we can put together. So making sure that you have a chance to kind of fill in those gaps. And now we will take this information that we're receiving today to include with what we already had kind of penciled in, so that we can write a draft that you would then have a chance to review before like the final publication and submission to the state. So again, as we take these things in, we appreciate your comments and thoughts today that we can add in again and to kind of fill in some of the spaces where we might have maybe missed certain intent or different pieces of information we want to include.
Could I ask one question? Andy, could I ask you a question, sir?
Sure.
What you're proposing would obviously, and I think you said it, but just to reiterate, is beyond content expectations. These would probably be school-wide efforts.
That's right. I mean, when the legislature did pass this big school climate initiative, which Melvina's predecessor was so actively involved in, and she's actively involved in it now and can talk about it. We've got to really reinforce those efforts to build a school climate of respect, of mutual respect and understanding.
Thank you, sir.
Angie.
When you talked about the buckets and you talked about civic education as bucket one, I wrote down the things you said. And after the civic seal, you said increase in civic credit for graduation requirements. Does that mean that this committee is advocating for more than the current required half credit? Because if so, I have things to say about that. Also.
So that certainly, that had been a concern of mine, that had been a concern of several other members of the task force along the way, of feeling that we're not out in front, we're not in the lead on requiring a full civic credit to graduate. There's about a dozen states that do require one full credit. Connecticut requires a half. And so there had been several pieces of discussion throughout the task force where people have suggested they would like to see that full credit. But happy to hear your concerns on that as well.
Sure. Well, if you add U.S. history to civics, like at my school, we have the full year of U.S. history at the high school and the half year of civics. So out of 4 years, that's almost half. And there is a rest of the world that we should consider too. So as someone who teaches electives and non-Western history and culture and geography until the end of this year, I don't know that I agree that we need to add more requirements. Every time you do, there's a ripple effect, as you know, even from other departments. When our school suddenly added senior health, a semester of senior health, one of my electives was decimated because the kids don't have room in their schedules. So I think that the legislature needs to think very carefully before they go adding requirements, because there are ripple effects that make it harder and harder for teachers to do our jobs. And it's hard enough.
Melvette.
I definitely have empathy for what you're saying. I'm going to speak as a parent, for the voice of parents. I think an approach that we've seen work, and sometimes they do it in AP classes, right, is that they do blended curriculum. So they'll see like English and American history. I'm not saying do it here. Like you'll see that happen in AP classes. I wonder if there's a better approach where it becomes a lens that's used, right? So we don't have to just talk about civics in a civics class, but we can talk about civic concepts in other classes. So if they're writing an essay, right, or they're learning how to write, like, can we write a sentence that says, I would like to vote one day when I grow up, right? And kind of spark curiosity throughout the school journey, as opposed to putting more mandates. So I agree, like there's a short day, lots of stuff to happen. And we also have curriculum, quite frankly, that's already interplayed, right, with the African American and Latino curriculum and all those things that we're offering at schools, except for, right, here's the news, that when students sign up for it, there are not enough students signing up for it. So then they can't take the class, right? Or there's not enough space, or there's not a teacher to teach it. So I don't want to necessarily create more for our teachers and our schools to absorb, but maybe there's a lens that can be used that we continue to embrace civic language and start teaching it earlier. I also would say, I'm not promoting our Parent Leadership Training Institute, but I am, which is a family civics initiative that we've been doing here in the state of Connecticut for 32 years. And we have a parallel curriculum that's a Children's Leadership Institute that pairs this parallel curriculum. The children who engage in that are ages 3 to 12. So 3 and 4-year-olds can learn civic concepts. So it's not that we have to continue to add different civics classes. It's civic language. It's, exposing them to these kinds of things, civic spaces, things like that.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Sure. So I just wanted to pick up on what Melvette had suggested in terms of the lenses, and I had really more of a point of information, and I guess a question for Mr. Armstrong, which is when we say that a school must offer, say, 1/2 credit or aspirationally a full credit in civics education, as a practical matter, what does that mean? Is a school required to offer a full course called civics, or can a school satisfy those requirements by blending the concepts with something else?
If every high school every student must take a course, a 1-semester course. It's called maybe different things in different schools. It might be called American Government. It might be called Civics, but it's a 1-semester course. Now don't forget that there's state standards, but in Connecticut, as we've discussed, if there's 165 towns, there's 165 versions of what's taught in that course. That each town has the ability, that's Connecticut, each town has the ability to create the course that the educators in that town think is best for those students. And again, there's other states where every kid in the state, if it's Tuesday morning, March 1st, every kid is taking that. That's not Connecticut.
Thank you. Ken.
Thank you, Kevin. I also want to build on what Melvette had said. A lot of good things are already happening, and we just don't know about them. And if I think one of the things that the report could be is to draw attention to the Center for Democracy that Sally runs at the old State House. I don't know what's it called, Melvette, that you just talked about?
The Parent Leadership Training Institute and the Children's Leadership Training
Yeah,
Institute. It's
I was
family
unaware of that
civics,
as
yeah.
well. The program I think John is involved with going to the 5th graders in the schools. Is that Allison Janney's program? The judges and attorneys go into the schools. We just started expanding that in Wethersfield. I went to one of the sessions. It was amazing. My point is, a lot of the answers already exist and they're already happening. They're not widespread throughout the state. So I hope the report can capture some of these best practices and spread them. We don't have to always reinvent the wheel. A lot of the work has already been done. We have to spread the message out, my opinion.
So Ken, thank you. You actually jumped ahead to the second bucket because that we will discuss that in that second bucket.
Right. Actually, I had a question about, that might be a first bucket question or a second bucket question. That was on adult civic education, which I'm not sure if that falls under civic engagement, but I know within the Bar Association Civics Education Committee, we had a 2-hour subcommittee meeting last week just focused on adult civics education, because we've decided that, and inspired by the work of this task force, that really should be our next frontier in terms of the message that we can get out. So we would just strongly encourage this task force to include adult civics education initiatives in the report in one bucket or the other.
Would it be a fair assessment, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but the actual sort of will of the group is not in favor of an additional requirement? I'm just trying to take notes here and I'm just trying to get the will of the group here.
You want individual.
Sorry, this is my day apparently to say things. Speaking to the fact that a lot of these things we're doing, y'all just don't know because we're in the classroom doing it. We don't have time to tell you what we're doing, and you don't just come walking in because that's not allowed either. But a lot of these things are happening. Civic ideas can be taught outside of civics class. In my Asian studies class, when we talk about China and communism, we back up and do an entire lesson on what is communism, capitalism, socialism, democracy. Like, where does that even fit? Because some people think communism and democracy are the opposite. So we back up and talk about all these things that I know they're going to get to you 2 years later in civics, but it's relevant. And in like a Western Civ or a world history class, you talk about Greece and you talk about democracy. So this stuff is infused, including current events, is infused all throughout. And we just might be doing more than you all realize.
Glad you say that. I had a long discussion.
Yeah, and I would add that like in our, we don't do it so much with the freshmen and sophomores who I have almost exclusively, but especially at the US history and civics level, they constantly do Socratic seminars where they talk about how to have a proper discussion with someone, how to look them in the eye, how to bring in other people who aren't speaking and then step back if you're speaking too much, and how to, how to be a cordial person and see both sides and do your research. So those soft skills are also being taught throughout our classes also.
Think it's just important that she said in regards to the awareness, because it's not just in the schools as well. It's also happening in the community. And I think it's important for community organizations to get that. Our community organization, Hartford Communities Decade, that I'm here representing, is partnered with the Secretary of State's office in that reason to get a Civics You Can Use series purposely for those things. As we have youth from Greater Hartford areas, schools, they go back and start, councils, clubs, and things like that to make sure, they're learning advocacy, public policy research, and different things like that. Levels of government. We've had chief legal counsel, deputy secretary, and most recently, December 7th, the Secretary of State came herself. And so not only just in the schools that folks are not really aware of, as she's speaking of the classroom, but again, in the community, it's happening as well. And again, the goal is to spread it wide so that way the awareness is here. So we're not thinking that, it's just stagnant in certain areas or other things aren't being taught that we're not aware about.
I would add that a lot of people, just adults that I talk to who complain about the schools, haven't been in a school since they were in school. And there is a tendency for adults to make assumptions that we are still doing what they did when they were in school, and we are not. Things have changed a lot since then, sometimes so fast that we can barely keep our nose above the water. But schools now are not what they used to be.
So to that end, a lot of the recent discussion here has kind of led us segue into that second bucket. So if there are no further questions on, those previous items from the education bucket, I'd like to move into the beyond the classroom civic engagement bucket, in which.
Well, Kevin, before you get to that, I just wanted to, answer Steve's question, which is I'm not in favor of further mandates in this area. And the legislature's gone way too far in mandated Holocaust education and Irish famine education, and it's really interfering with the educational environment, and also it's sort of encourages the issue of the day to be incorporated by legislation, and the Chapter 10 of the Connecticut General Statutes is now littered with curricular requirements, which are not very useful in many cases.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, I understand as someone who put in legislation for this a few years ago and kind of received some pushback on this, and I understand the reason why. And as a teacher myself, I understand when the curricular mandates kind of get in the way of our ability to reach every child, and every student wants to every student should have some choice and voice in their education. So I understand that. And so perhaps what we could be asking is, rather than a curriculum mandate, for continued development of civic, current affairs programming or curriculum development from the State Department of Education, so that there's a more robust curriculum to be rolled out, so that teachers of civics across the state of Connecticut have access to more materials, better materials for their instruction, which would hopefully increase the quality of civic education across the state. And I feel, again, as someone who proposed a bill that would have increased civics to a full year credit, that would be a fair compromise.
Just one other brief point, very brief, is I would say another issue with civics that I don't know that we can address is, for various reasons, many districts don't teach as much in the elementary grades as they once did in social studies. So I think a problem, which I don't know that we can address at all, is that there's some kids that aren't even having any civics till they get like middle school. I think to get social studies back in the elementary schools, as efforts are being made to do, would give us as much bang for the buck as this.
Agreed. So moving back into the bucket on beyond the classroom, adult civic engagement and civic life, one of the things that, again, that we tried to encompass from previous discussions was what has been touched on already here, of enhancing the visibility of the existing programs that are currently operating in the state, that are doing this good work of finding ways to incorporate more of that and to replicate that across the state. And again, we've heard just today about some of those programs that are running, which is the intent behind this, is how do we need to make these more visible and to be able to replicate them so that more people have access to these civically engaging programs. So that was point number one under that bucket. Also, there was discussion around service programs and people having access to programs where they are able to serve communities. And we had talked in previous discussions, I know Ted had brought up points about service requirements, similar to previous times in American history, CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, things where they were service programs for people aside from military service to serve their community, but suggesting the increase of service program opportunities. And then also the work being done by groups like Connecticut Humanities and promoting more and development across different organizations outside of the educational sphere, and then making those resources available. There had been discussion about some of the programs that are used in schools, but that make their way home, things like iCivics and other programming that's already being done in schools that make their way home to families, and families having access to those programs and being kind of taught how to use those programs, whether it's through their children or not, as adults outside of a school setting, and having access to those. And then, of course, a civic health index to be able to measure if these things are happening or working and where our state stands as far as its civic health. So that would have been, that's the second bucket on civic engagement. So if anyone has any questions or pertinent points that they would want to add to this, this would be the time.
John, where would you guess that the work of your organization is going to go with this, or is it too early to guess that?
I think it's too early to guess that, or at least it's too early to put together a timeline in terms of the kind of things that we could produce. We were also conscious of, again, recognizing our own limitations and also our own expertise, and possibly starting with projects that address contemporary legal issues that you might see in the media, and coming up with a way to distill those down and package them for consumption. So I think it seems that that's where we're probably going to start. And I think we also recognize we couldn't do it alone, and we probably would reach out to our partners with the Secretary of State's office in particular to disseminate those. But I think we're probably at least 6 months off from having 1 or 2 items ready to go.
I just have a comment as it relates to using the Civic Health Index to measure some of the recommendations if they're implemented. So I think that we would have to put in a request for a recommendation to fund 2 civic health indexes. So one is almost a pre that we're level setting and seeing where we are. And then once these types of things are implemented, where do we stand after? And hoping that we would see movement. So I think there might be 2 that would be recommended.
Thank you. Very valid point. Other questions or additions to items in the second civic engagement bucket? Okay, and seeing none online. That would move us then into the third and final bucket, which is media literacy. And while it may seem that we have done not as much to discuss the importance of media literacy in here, or that it hasn't received as much attention, I feel is that it is incorporated, it needs to be incorporated across all of these things. And so the recommendation that kind of we've coalesced around is the idea that media literacy is not a one-time, one-off course requirement, that media literacy needs to continue to be incorporated throughout a K through 12 education system, because it's not something that you're going to be able to easily learn or pick up and figure out how to do one time as a high school student, right? So finding, requesting and making the recommendation that we continue to develop a robust media literacy curriculum to be incorporated across disciplines. It's not to be a one subject course, that multiple course disciplines use media in their instruction, in their learning. And so media literacy curriculum development needs to be inclusive of all those different course disciplines. So the recommendation being that State Department of Education would continue to develop a robust media literacy curriculum to be implemented K through 12, not in one particular grade. Are there any questions or comments to that item? You take those.
Angie, where's media literacy in your school? I mean, does everyone teach that, or?
I don't know that it's explicitly like now we will have a lesson on media literacy, but we all obviously understand the importance of it, and there's discussion as needed throughout the year, anytime. I mean, it's a constant teachable moment, right? Kid uses AI for something, or they present something and you're like, what is the source? How did you, okay, pause everybody. Let's look at source vetting. Do you even know what the word vetting means? And then you, you know, and I would imagine they're doing it at the middle school too. Could there be a more sequential, purposeful framework? Absolutely. Does it need to be, again, this many lessons per year, this year, do it this way? No, but yeah, we could use some training and guidance on that, because I could see some of that being hit more in some classes by some teachers than others. You know, some focus more on writing essays with sources that are given to them versus others where the kids are researching and you start talking about citation and vetting and plagiarism and all those things. Like these, plagiarism is an age-old issue where you talk about, you know, not only what to do with the source, but what kind of source is it. The library media specialists focus on this a lot too. It's like they have a curriculum, but they don't have a classroom. So sometimes they try to push into our classrooms and we can tell someone's making them do this and it feels weird. So seamlessly integrating it in a purposeful way would be helpful. And that's a big one. That's a big thing to bite off, but it would be helpful. Yeah.
And to add on to that, certainly the library media specialists do play a big role here. And I think this is where we're seeing a shift from the traditional librarian that maybe we had grown up in schools that we attended, that now the shift is to how to use multimedia content. And this is an area where, whereas many schools have been closing their libraries or shifting their libraries, I know my own librarian in the school where I teach is always nervous that, you know, her job is on the line. But I feel that that can be part of this recommendation as well, is that this incorporates that library media science, that specialty, that they can be incorporated here to help build in throughout, because they are not one discipline subject area teachers, that their skills that they have and that they can help to teach can be brought in across disciplines and already being done in many districts. That could be more intentional, and that should be, in my opinion, part of the recommendation as well, that this is an area where their expertise is very valuable to help students understand that regardless of what discipline they're studying, that there's the need to be able to vet sources and to be able to use the media that's at their disposal to their advantage with credible information.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how it ends up looking like when I assign, and again, I have freshmen and sophomores, so they really don't know how to do this sometimes, but okay, so what databases do we have and how do you even find them? Or God help us if I take them to the library and say, you're going to use books, because they don't know about an index versus a table of contents. And we have to talk about that now because they're so used to Ask Siri. But sometimes it means the library media specialist comes in for 10 minutes to my class to talk about, okay, here's what we have in our library. But I feel like sometimes in practice, the kids are like, oh, here comes that lady again. What's she doing in here? And then they start, you know, whatever they're doing. So I feel like maybe a train the trainer thing might be good, because this is their area of expertise. They could train us on how to instruct these things with short lessons or certain skills. Because it's not, I mean, we understand it. We all went to college and grad school, but like this specific thing and how much it's changed since we went to college and grad school, like the media specialists, that's their jam. But putting them directly in front of the kids, there aren't enough of them to do that. And, you know, how do you do that anyway? And putting pressure on them to do that's not fair to them. It's not fair to us. There's not enough time already. But I think that PD, and this is each school would have to decide this, I guess, but you could recommend it, that PD time be spent for library media specialists to train the teachers on how to do this, so that we can figure out how, when, and where to seamlessly incorporate it into what we're already doing. But we don't have time to go and research, how do you teach media literacy? Let me figure that out real quick while I'm also teaching everything else. It's too many balls to juggle. So let them train us, but that takes time. And often that becomes a do it whenever. I don't know when you're supposed to do it, but like purposeful use of PD time that often could be better used, as you know, as a teacher.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Doesn't the social studies inquiry arc, the way it's set up, almost imply that media literacy is part of all the study effort? I mean,
Yes.
it does. I mean, it's so what are we saying, that we just want to focus on it more? Or, I mean, it's already, we already say that, don't we, with our social studies inquiry arc?
And you're right, Ted, it does. And I think what kind of the purpose of this recommendation would be, and Angie just kind of alluded to this, of like the intentionality behind this. Like we have to be purposeful and intentional about using it. Yes, the inquiry arc already includes media literacy in there, but how much of that is really being taught?
Yes.
You know, as teachers, are we being trained by our content experts, our library media specialists who can help train us like to turnkey it to students, of leveraging that and leveraging their expertise to be able to do it more and to be intentional about the instruction. It doesn't make sense as a one-off class, standalone class. It's how can we seamlessly integrate this across all of our multidisciplinary lives, and certainly in all the courses that students are taking. So it's being intentional, and it has been my view of this in its entirety with civics, is that yes, it already exists in statute that we require offering this, but are we being intentional about it? And we have to be more intentional about it. So, I mean, to me, in the recommendation is making this an intentional piece of what we're doing, like putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, with the statute that's already there, requiring it. Let's actually act on it.
Yeah, good.
Okay. And Andy Feinstein online.
Yeah, I am concerned if we are cabining the notion of media literacy to the preparation of papers and plagiarism. It seems to me that there's a much more broad skill that needs to be taught to students and adults as well, which is to treat what's online with a certain level of skepticism. And that's not just when you're preparing a paper for your social studies teacher. It's when you're reading tweets. And so I just want to say I'm uncomfortable so limited. I could certainly see a student coming with the impression that I've got to be very careful about sources when I'm writing a paper for Mr. Brown. But when I'm repeating stuff about drones over New Jersey, I don't really care what the source is. It was on Twitter. It's good enough for me.
Andy, your point is well taken, and I certainly don't mean to make it seem as if that's how we're couching it, is just in the writing of papers. I agree with you completely, and deal with numerous adults who don't have the skill to be able to decipher credible information on the internet. So it seems to reason that this could be included also in that civic engagement bucket category here as well, that we are wanting this media literacy to be taught so that it crosses over from student to adult, that we have the ability and people have the ability to question and that have that healthy skepticism of what they're seeing online, that it's not just about academic paper writing, it's about being able to understand and take in that information and decipher and determine credibility. So I agree with you.
Thank you.
And just the other obvious note, the exciting new world of what is the role of AI in schools? That's another topic that different schools are looking at in very different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments or additions to the third and final bucket, the media literacy? Well, with that said, as already said today several times, that the intention now is for myself and Steve to take this information that we've coalesced around over these previous meetings, and to kind of fill in the gaps of what the understanding we already had was with some of the discussion from today, for us to produce a report within the next 3 weeks or so, to then turn that draft report out to you for your viewing, so that you'd be able to make any final edits and suggestions for us to meet mid to late January for one final time to approve the report, so that we would be able to submit the report at the end of January. So if there are no other questions or comments, I'd like to thank you all again for being here today and for your participation in this task force along the way. It's almost over. I feel like some good work is being done, and hopefully that will amount to some positive steps forward for the state of Connecticut and our civic health as a state. So I'll let Steve have a moment for some final words.
It's just that I don't know exactly how to do this. but we talked about 10 great programs today that exist outside the school, right? That different groups are doing. I bet you there's another 25 that we don't even know about. So I think maybe a recommendation would be some effort to make sure that the 25 we don't know about and the 15 we talked about today get more publicity.
Absolutely. So you can look forward to seeing that recommendation in the report as well. And so with that, if there's no other business of the day, we'll go ahead and call the meeting adjourned. And thank you all again for your participation. I hope you all have a happy, safe, and healthy holiday season.
And if you're teaching, make sure there's a lot of learning going on in the next week, right?